Many people have a love for history. I was recently registering for classes for my first semester in college, and looking at the courses offered, I saw history courses that were listed. Most were of American history, modern topics like the French Revolution, and if you're lucky, some medieval history as well. But that only covers less than 2,000 years of the human experience. There is another side of history. Well before the birth of Christ is another world, much older and seemingly frozen in time, yet just as fascinating as any other time period. Let's break the ice and discover the true greatness of ancient Mesopotamian history. First, we start with the beginning of civilization. Well, civilization in anthropological terms is quite simply urbanism. The development of urban societies is a complex story, and it's actually built upon a lot more desperation and difficult choices than is usually imagined. To better understand this process, we need to contextualize the Earth on a climactic scale. 13,000 years ago, the Earth was gradually getting warmer, leaving its previous glacial period. This coincided with hunter gatherer humanity shifting its lifestyle from Paleolithic communities to Mesolithic communities. This meant that we went from small groups of 20 to 40 individuals, highly nomadic and following the migration patterns of megafauna, to larger groups of a couple hundred more settled around sources of food like lakes and forests. This Mesolithic revolution inspired new developments in technology, like fishing nets and dog domestication. Surely, society must have drastically changed as well in ways we can't see in archaeology. When I'm referring to changes in ways that we speak, trade, love, hate, and overall deal with each other as human beings, things which we may never understand from their perspectives. All of these slow processes were thrown away with a climactic event known as the Younger Dryas. We're not exactly sure why this happened, possibly a comet crashed into Earth. But despite the period of warming, the Earth drastically cooled. The delicate flora which Mesolithic society increasingly relied on, like fruit bushes and nut trees, died in the impending cold snap, shaking entire ecosystems. In a final act of desperation, humans, particularly in the Levant, modern day Syria, Lebanon, Israel, and Palestine, experimented with grinding and eating wild grasses. These were ancestors of wheat, barley, and rye. Over time, humans also experimented with deliberate replanting, for example, throwing some seeds back into the ground after harvest. These grasses were much more durable than the fruit bushes of the Mesolithic period, surviving the cold snap and letting humans experiment with deliberate planting and even artificial selection. Farming was finally invented, and again I want to highlight that this was out of desperation. In fact, studying the bones of ancient hunter gatherers and comparing them to early farmers, the hunter gatherers were likely healthier, because they were taller, so they must have suffered from less malnutrition. Nevertheless, farming opened a world of possibilities, which could lead to its continued use long after the apocalyptic Younger Dryas. Farming was much further developed and refined over millennia over the hilly regions of the Levant, Anatolia, and the Zagros Mountains. There was notably little farming in Mesopotamia itself. The early farmers practiced a technique known as slash and burn agriculture. Farmers would find a hillside with forest coverage. They would then chop down the forest and burn it. The resulting ashes would fertilize the ground for crops to be planted on. The crops would receive rainwater. This meant that societies were still semi-nomadic because the process wasn't sustainable and there were only so many forests. Mesopotamia was not farmed to as much of an extent. It had rivers but no rain. For most of the year, the Mesopotamian soil was too dry and hard to penetrate by hand to plant seeds. This was true for until 4000 BC when the cattle plow was invented. The plow, which was pulled by domesticated cattle, would penetrate even the toughest of soils. With this new technology in hand, Mesopotamia was finally being settled by farmers. And with that, the history of Mesopotamia can begin. Mesopotamian society, as revolutionary as it's usually imagined, was in many ways a continuation of tribal society. The following section will explain two things: the politics and the economics of tribal society and how they evolved into early urban societies of Mesopotamia. Starting with politics, how did tribal societies make decisions? Who made them? We generally understand them to be egalitarian, but that's simplistic. Decision making in tribal societies was informed by three things. The first was superstition. Superstition is a driving source for decision making across the animal kingdom. Studies have shown that even pigeons can be superstitious. Especially in a world without empirical science, our understanding of the world is informed by sets of heuristics which make decision making quicker for us, especially when knowledge is limited. These include confirmation bias, looking for patterns where there might not be any. Prehistoric man didn't have the privilege of advanced statistical analysis. Superstition eventually gave rise to primitive religion. For example, the idea of taboo, that simply uttering a word could bring misfortune, which comes from Polynesian tribal societies. Secondly was family, but not the nuclear family as we imagine, a mom, dad, and a few kids. I'm talking about clans, with grandparents and aunts and uncles and many, many cousins. People grew up closely relying on their families in almost every aspect of life, and especially in learning. Wisdom was important, and so naturally older people were given more power. In agricultural tribes like the Iroquois and those of the Congo, the clan leaders were usually grandmothers, making them matriarchal. Women were also vital in wars, pressuring men not to be cowardly and to fight. Lastly was personal skill and charisma. Even the largest tribes were made up of at most 1,000 people, so everyone knew everyone. Being highly respectable as an individual could get you far in a tightly knit community. This sort of individual was usually known as a big man because he was usually also wealthy. Early Mesopotamia kept many of these ideas when transitioning from tribal to urban life. The first cities, like Uruk, were ruled by a class of priests. The early priests were essentially wise men who mastered much of what I talked about before and were given managerial roles. Eventually, their images were clouded with much more idealization and propaganda as the societies grew into tens of thousands of people, and many people didn't personally know the priests. So, who were they, and why were they so trusted with so much power? The priests of Mesopotamia were essentially primitive meteorologists and hydraulics engineers. In fact, the priestly class was usually heavily tied to primitive science across the world, historically speaking, but that's a story for another day. So they know a lot about weather and water physics, or at least claim to. Big deal. Why is this important? To understand that, we must understand the issues that early societies of Mesopotamia faced. Like I said before, Mesopotamia had no rainfall, and the conditions around its settlement were only hard won due to technological advancement in the first place. The land between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers was dry, completely barren of resources, and unpredictable. The way that the land was so punishing to its inhabitants both contributed to the initial ingenuity of Mesopotamian society and its ultra-religious paranoia later on. In a land without rainfall, and where the rivers flooded at various frequencies and intensities, nature was terrifying. The rivers could leave the land starved of water and dry for years, yet have an intense flood and destroy all your crops and housing. The rivers needed to be both heavily engineered and, due to superstition even, worshipped to be reliable. These necessities manifested themselves into the first mega-projects, and with them the first signs of civilization. A megaproject is one that is so huge that it requires a permanent managerial class to delegate labor and resources. For Mesopotamia, that class was the priests. The priests claimed to understand the storm god Enlil and the rest of the gods who commanded nature. They said that the rivers can be tamed with irrigation, but the hearts and minds of the gods can be tamed with sacrifices too, leading to the construction of temples. Together, the first canals and temples attracted large labor movements and resource movements that could only be possible with centralized authority. Civilization began with a problem and it thrived with a solution. Once again, to understand Mesopotamian economics, how the society chose to divide resources, we must go back to tribal society. It's always been believed, especially by classical economists, that all of the tribal and ancient peoples used a bartering system for trade before the invention of currency. This simply is not true. Tribal societies distributed resources based on the fact that they all personally knew each other. and they used a system known as reciprocity, something that you should be familiar with yourself. When you give your friend a present for their birthday, and now you expect a present on yours without directly asking for it, that's reciprocity. The exchange of resources based on implicit cultural tradition. This sort of stuff dominates the tribal economy. Individuals at times could even show off their wealth by how much they could give. And this sort of year-round exchange makes sense. In a simple tribal world where you only need so many things, if you're the one asking for something, then you probably have little to offer in return at this very moment. But what you can offer is trust, that you will be there in the future. The early urban dwellers of ancient Mesopotamia didn't forget this, and it was especially important for farmers. Farmers needed commodities year-round, of course, yet they only had something to offer themselves during harvest season. So, farmers would promise other households wheat in the future in exchange for goods now. As the towns became cities and there was more animosity between people, that you were less likely to personally know the average person, then artificial systems had to be constructed to make up for the lack of trust. Now, in a trade, a farmer might give, say a pottery maker, a clay tablet with a symbol on it in exchange for some pots. The tablet, both parties would agree, represents the wheat that the farmer owes. These symbols eventually became more complex and specific, leading to what we now call writing. These were receipts. The writing was called cuneiform, and the language was Sumerian, so we now call the first inhabitants of Mesopotamia the Sumerians. A new unit of the domestic economy emerged, the household. Slightly smaller than a clan, although clans still existed, yet still larger than a nuclear family. The household would have farming duties twice a year, yet during the year itself it would engage in a complex, ever-changing secondary and tertiary jobs. The average household was highly adaptable, and trade happened between households on a regular basis. Yet, in the face of such a large project like building a temple, thousands of clay tablets from each individual household might be daunting. Indeed, the first temple institutions of Mesopotamia were actually banks. The temple would store seeds, among other goods, and loan them out to households in need with no interest rate but high collateral. You risked a lot for not paying back in time. Priests were most literate, but literacy was likely pretty well spread throughout the populace as well, given its importance in the function of the economy. Furthermore, even though there was still no real resemblance of written law yet, failing to fulfill a receipt could lead to punishment. Many neighborhoods of the city were still well connected enough to take matters into their own hands and punish any undesirables of a community. Hilariously, we once even found a clay tablet from a man complaining that the bronze that he was promised, when he finally received it, was of terrible quality. Oh yeah, bronze. We talked about domestic economy, but what about on the international scale? Well, to discuss that, we have to talk about kings and nobles. This early period of Sumerian history we call the Uruk period because of the dominance of the city of Uruk. But how was it dominant? We know it had trade colonies across Mesopotamia and beyond. Mesopotamia was completely barren of resources, so to get them you'd either have to fight for them or trade with foreign communities. Bronze, the precious metal alloy that could be used to make high-quality tools and weapons, needed both copper and tin. Copper is found everywhere, but tin has major deposits only in a few places in the world, like Europe and Afghanistan, but notably not Mesopotamia. So it had to be imported. The western route from Europe's source came from far in the Mediterranean through Sardinia, Malta, Crete, Phoenicia, and Syria before finally reaching the Sumerians. The eastern route from Afghanistan's source came from the Indus River in Pakistan and by ship through the Gulf of Persia. These trade expeditions weren't naturally occurring between profiteering merchants, but deliberate expeditions set out by each city government. This meant deals were larger and more fixed. Other commodities were traded as well, especially luxury commodities like lapis, gold, perfume, and decorative items like pottery. When a society exported its pottery, that didn't mean the adjacent societies couldn't make pottery. It's quite easy to make. It likely means that the adjacent societies had high respect for the artistic expression of the pottery, and that's something that can't necessarily be replicated from culture to culture. There was also the question of labor for large city projects. The citizens of each city didn't really want to haul giant bricks all day in between their busy schedules. They would have rather enslaved neighboring towns and used them for labor work. So in early Mesopotamia, war was fought to get slaves, and there was seldom interest in holding on to a conquered city, so empires never formed, but massive slave labor forces were controlled by the temple for construction of mega projects. At a certain point, cities were building defensive walls as well. The people who made a living off of taking part in war likely became the nobility. It's possible that this early nobility was actually outside nomadic tribes rather than from within the cities themselves. This would explain how they could implicitly see themselves as different from the average citizen. This nobility, first entrusted to defend the city and raid for its betterment, would eventually monopolize brute force. But for now, they were once again managers, just managers of war and foreign relations. They lived in a large house known as the palace, but they didn't just hang out there. It was a lively place where they ran entire luxury industries and would be exported on the international market in turn for goods of other palaces. And these luxury industries were monopolies. Not just anyone could start producing their own perfumes or oils or etc. To be sure, the palace functioned completely separately from the temple. The palace could take out loans from the temple, but it by no means had any power over it. The kings and nobles could brandish their swords and spears all they wanted, but the priests still had the fear of the gods, nature herself, as leverage. And at this stage, it was still a very real fear. So I explained how Mesopotamian society functioned from roughly 3500 BC to 2300 BC. But what was their perspective? In other words, what was their worldview, their culture? Well, to discuss this, we have to go past 2900 BC, where writing, especially in the literary and artistic form, was more prevalent. I already alluded to this before. Mesopotamian society was heavily centered on its relationship to nature and the gods. There was an immense fear of nature, as the land of Mesopotamia was unpredictable and cruel. There was an immense fear of outsiders, as slave raids were common. There was an all-around fear, and this was expressed in how the Sumerians viewed their gods. To the Sumerians, humanity was created with the sole purpose of serving the gods. That's it. Humans would only be spared if they were useful to the gods. For example, the Sumerians had their own flood myth, similar to the Bible, except the gods only sent the flood because there were too many humans and they were getting too noisy. This is in contrast to the biblical telling, where the flood is sent because of some moral righteousness. Worship was expressed through sacrifices, and yes, a lot of resources were used to placate the gods, whether by lavish sacrificial ceremonies or construction of massive temples. Each city had its own patron god, meaning the god that basically owned them and who they had to serve. There was also an immense fear of the outside world, meaning of anyone who wasn't the city residents. This included barbarians, other cities, etc. In a world before a defined legal code, order defined by tradition and taboo was immensely important in Sumer, and the wild chaos of the outside world seemed to threaten that. These fears are best personified by the character Enkidu in the Epic of Gilgamesh. In the story, the gods send Enkidu, a wild man, to punish Gilgamesh for being unruly. But who was Gilgamesh? Gilgamesh was the king of Uruk, actually called Alugol. Alugol was a Sumerian king who exercised his right to rule by his own personal skill. So not necessarily like the kings of, say, medieval Europe, who ruled by hereditary right. That being said, the Lugols were no gods themselves, and the Sumerian people knew that. Gilgamesh, in the story, seeks out immortality, but ultimately accepts his mortality and his powerlessness compared to the gods. This represents how the secular Lugols of Sumer were never really able to convince the Sumerians that they were any more than just people, equally as subservient to the extreme mercilessness of the gods. If you know Egyptian history, you know this is a huge deal, because the king of Egypt did manage to convince everyone he was a god. This never happened in Sumer. I mentioned how each city had a patron god. The fear of the outside world was as real as the fear of the gods, yet each Sumerian city-state remained violently independent from each other. Raids would be held, but outright conquest was never an option, as that was represented in the extreme admiration for each city's patron god. Well, soon that would all change, and soon a foreigner, how we now know as Enheduanna, would become the high priestess of Uruk. By the end of the 2000s BC, Mesopotamia went from being an apocalyptic wasteland to a highly urbanized apocalyptic wasteland. Cities swelled, walls got taller, temples got bigger, and dikes and canals grew longer. Sumerian society was solidifying into a regular mold. The Sumerian king list was a near definitive list of all the kings of the various city-states, and many of the kings, according to legend, ruled for millennia. Royal court culture developed with new customs and roles for servants. It all felt so normal that Sumerians started to believe that civilization had always existed since the creation of the universe. Their entire world was about to change. Upstream of the Tigris and Euphrates rivers was the city of Akkad. The inhabitants of Akkad weren't exactly Sumerian. They spoke a Semitic language instead, which is more related to modern-day Arabic or Hebrew. But they adapted much of Sumerian culture, including cuneiform writing. One such Akkadian was King Sargon, and he didn't just want to adopt Sumerian culture. He wanted the land of Sumer itself. To do the unthinkable of military conquest, he embarked on a journey from Upper Mesopotamia down south. Because he was traveling downstream, it was easier to supply his army, a glorified mob of peasants, year-round. Sargon penetrated the walls of each Sumerian city one by one. Akkad itself also sat in an area where the Tigris and Euphrates rivers met quite close to each other, allowing for both to be traveled. This geographic advantage allowed for Sargon to quickly conquer the whole region of Sumer. From there, Sargon didn't stop, conquering further into the Levant and even reaching the Mediterranean. But unlike previous war leaders, he didn't just take loot and leave. He replaced the ruling elite of each city with loyal Akkadians. One such individual was Enheduanna, daughter of Sargon and high priestess of Ishtar in the city of Ur. She helped her father embark on a grandiose plan of assimilation. Sargon dreamed of a future where the Akkadian and Sumerian pantheons were combined into a single one, and making an Akkadian high priestess of a Sumerian city would help reach that goal. Enheduanna was also arguably the first author in history, as many of her poems still survive, and she was experimenting with the study of rhetoric long before Plato and Aristotle. Under Sargon, the civilized world was ruled as one. There was much bloodshed, but Mesopotamians finally had their first taste of empire. It wouldn't last, as shortly after Sargon's death, the empire collapsed and Sumer entered a dark age due to a climactic event known as the 4.2 kiloyear event. Mesopotamia ended the 3rd millennium BC with chaos, as cities scrambled to reinstall their old power whilst battling food shortages, before finally being invaded by the barbarians of the east simply known as the Gutians. Thus the 2nd millennium BC began with turmoil, a kind of turmoil that begged to be tamed and navigated by cunning men. Those cunning men would appear, once again from the outside, and they would change civilization forever. Join us next time when we discuss Babylon, prophets, and the age of the chariot. But for now, I will leave you with a quote from Enheduanna herself, describing Inanna, the goddess of love, sex, war, and beauty. On the wide and silent plain, darkening the bright daylight, she turns midday into darkness. People look upon each other in anger. They look for combat. Their shouting disturbs the plain. It weighs on the pasture and the wasteland. Her howling is like Icarus, and makes the flesh of all the lands tremble. No one can oppose her murderous battle. Who rivals her? No one can look at her fierce fighting, the carnage, the engulfing water, raging, sweeping over the earth. She leaves nothing behind. The story of Mesopotamia is one of self-imposed helplessness against the forces of nature. Yet at the same time, Mesopotamians managed to accomplish amazing feats time and time again in the face of near annihilation. Alas, their greatest adversity would become their own apathy toward their own existence.